what we are trying to do, or what we are doing tonight, rather than doing just a presentation, we thought we'd try to sort of recreate a studio visit. I was at Joanna's when we were discussing this, and I said, well, why don't we just do it as a studio visit? And also, I think in a way it's a tribute to all the studio visits I've been to, the artists I've visited throughout the many decades now of my life in the art world, and I must say that some of them they've been all over the place, and many of them have been fantastic. Some of them didn't seem so fantastic. I don't know whose part, maybe mine, but they always turned out later to be fabulous. And I also think of the days when studio visits meant perhaps going to Soho or even further out, and you just kind of called up, and and the keys came down in a sock, and usually it was bitter cold, and then you got in somehow, and you started walking up these stairs, many flights, and you were probably taking your life into your hands. But in any event, to all of you and all the studio visits. So let's start. So this is Joanna's, these will be some views of Joanna's studio to start off. Should you talk? Well, if you like. Joanna's going to walk us through her studio in a way, but I'm just going to show some of the images. Let me just go back. Let's start again. Okay. So this is a view from...
This is the back part of the studio, and actually this studio is I've been in it for about 35 years, and it is a walk-up. It is a walk-up, this studio. I've been in it for about 35 years. Can you hear me? No? Maybe it's not working. Can you hear it now? Yes? Okay. So I've been in this studio for about 35 years. What you are seeing on the screen now is the back part of the studio. It's where I work on the sort of medium to smaller size paintings, and this is a group of things that were, so one of the paintings was in the Wiesbaden show. I worked on them simultaneously, the two on the opposite walls, and then I brought out these two small ones, which were much earlier, because I wanted to look at them all together, because I frequently work in sort of themes that run through many years. The back wall paintings are from 2013, and this one on the right hand, the pink, black, and yellow, is from 2019. And it carries through some thoughts that I've had about the work in different forms, and you'll see it in the next slides too.
And essentially, we're just running through, and we'll talk about the works in more detail later, because also this talk is about process, I think. Any comments on this, or shall we just move?
So this is also a painting that I was just finishing here in this picture for the Wiesbaden show. You can see a crumpled paper in the foreground. That's I frequently use that to block off areas when I'm painting. You can see tape, which I use, but I don't usually stick with the kind of line that you get with a taped, and we'll talk about that later. I usually kind of smush the edges so that they're a little bit softer. You'll see in the next slide that there's a mix of works. This was also in the show. You'll see a mix of works, large and small. I work back and forth in different scales, and we'll kind of get to that a little bit later maybe. You can see there's stuff tacked on the wall, like everybody tacks things on the walls. there's some sort of drawings that I was thinking about in relation to these particular works. And the next slide is, we're moving towards the front of the studio, and this is where I work on the larger paintings. That's my floor, which everybody loves, but which has gotten to the point where when I drop something on it, I can't find it. So it's time to kind of repaint, I think. The next slide will show the fact that there is really a lot of booming light. I'm very fortunate. It's northern light, and I get a lot of it. And it really affects how I work. I become very interested in the surfaces because I see them so acutely with this raking light. And I frequently work with matte and glossy, which really, those two things become very activated in the light of my studio. Don't always see it in other kinds of situations, but in my studio it's very, very active.
But it's northern light.
It's northern light, yeah.
And then
next. And this is just one of the paintings that I'm working on the opposite wall.
Oops, sorry.
And yeah, and then this is with the lights off in the back. I fool around with the lights to try to see how these things are going to look in different situations, and also you can see that the light is very directional, that it's all coming in from the front. And I look frequently at the sides of the work to sort of get at that feeling of which passages are going to be matte, which passages are going to be shiny, and how they're going to relate to one another. And this is the wall to my storage. It's a rolling wall, and I work on small things there.
It's the same back wall, but just opened.
Yeah, and this is something that is just from about 6 months ago.
And one of the first questions Joanna said most people ask her when they come on a studio visit, they inquire about the shape of the work, and so we thought we'd talk about that immediately, but more in a kind of technical way. So here are some images. This is, perhaps you should start, in terms of how you transpose these things from drawings into the actual very intricate supports.
Yeah, I have a really analog way of dealing with transposing drawings to from small to large. I have usually just sort of some drawings, ideas in notebooks, which we'll look at a little bit further on. And from those I come to some sort of image or relationship or configuration of panels that I want to make large. And I take very large sheets of paper and adhere them to the wall, and then I just draw. And this process actually takes a long time, because I kind of make incremental changes until it feels right.
But do you determine the scale immediately?
Yeah, and the reason I do it this way is because I need to really feel the scale of it. It needs to be, I can't take a picture and then, have somebody blow it up. So this allows me to really know the form, essentially, before it goes to fabrication. And so this, this shows you, all of these changes, slight changes that the thing goes through, or sometimes major changes that they go through. and it takes a while. And then I take the things off the wall and put them on the floor, because these are all hand-drawn when they're on the wall, and I take it off the wall and put it on the floor. And then I have this sort of, this is plumber's wire, they use this to kind of, clean out drains, basically, but it's coiled very tightly, and I staple that around my pencil drawings on the floor to get a hard line, and then I draw with a pentel around it. It's kind of laborious, but it allows me to get all the idiosyncrasies of the drawing into the final panels. Because what happens then is I give this whole drawing to my fabricator, and he uses it as a template. So it has within it, because the forms are not geometric, they're really just, they're very hand-drawn, and they're very intuitive. So this allows this makes them as close to being a drawing as possible after they're fabricated.
When did you determine using that coil, and tell me again why that works for you? It does seem very laborious.
Because if you're trying to draw something on the wall, you just can't freehand. It's very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, I have to give him a hard edge thing. I have to give him a really specific drawing. So the wire, I don't know how I found this, but I did, and it just allows me to make a very hard, perfect line to give to the fabricator, and then he makes the panels, and they're constructed with plywood, and I think they're pretty amazing.
They're as beautiful as a
They're
perrier.
actually very nice
Right?
without anything on them, and I
Right.
frequently tell them I should just show them that way.
As I said, you and Martin Perrier.
I know, really. They have so there's a cleating system, which you can see, and then there are pins between the panels which register them so that you can't you can't alter the image. It's fixed in place.
And then, voila.
And then they end up looking like this. So that's, I stretch canvas over the panels, since my conservator friends tell me I should never work directly on the panel. And then it's gessoed and it's ready to go. And then I work, as you can see, in different scales. So I have like bigger things and then medium-sized things and then very small things. The small things are really different because they're cut. My assistant cuts them out of MDL or MDF or whatever, and but I can edit them. I can alter them if I want. So I'm actually drawing on them, painting on them, but I have the potential to make big changes in the form itself. And so that's an essential difference. In a way, they're kind of harder to make. They're more moving parts. But it becomes a way to explore new possibilities, explore new forms. However, I don't really refer to these. I mean, they are like studies, but I never actually. I don't think I've ever made a large painting from a small painting. They seem to have a scale of their own, and I make them to work at that scale. and after I'm finished, I don't have any desire to really make another one bigger. So they're just kind of another way of thinking about the forms and the drawing within them, really.
But you do maintain that semblance, anyway, of multiple panels.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. When I first started making the smaller pieces, I actually did do separate shapes and put them together, but it was such a pain in the neck. It was so hard to do, and I decided that if I could just give a feeling of there being separations, that it was fine. I didn't need to. So these are one single piece, and sometimes I bevel them. Sometimes we bevel the edges, and then sometimes in the next slide you'll see that this is one that is not beveled, and then it presents another kind of situation because you have this edge which needs to get dealt with. It doesn't sort of disappear. So these, I paint. I let layers come through, and they're as much painted in a sense as the front of it. They become part of the painting in the way that the front does.
So you said that when you were in New Mexico, in the 80s, this is when you came up with doing multiple panels, that you've always felt a kind of dissatisfaction with the rectangular format. So would you talk a little bit about that in terms of starting off with the photographs and then how you proceeded from there? You might also say what you had against the rectangle.
Well, yes, if you go to the next image, you'll see what I did a lot of. I should say that, I have been going out to New Mexico and working for periods of time since the mid-'70s, and that my first trip there was just I just had an enormous response, and it permeated my thinking about what I wanted to make for many, many years. But I dealt with the thoughts that I had, or my perceptions of the place, by trying to. My perceptions of the place really had to do with this amazing scale and sort of vast space and amazing light and all of those things. And for many years, I tried to deal with that by adding panels to my paintings and just making them bigger. And then when in the 80s, in the late 80s, I spent time in an architect friend's house that was a berm building that he had made, and I would go up to the roof, and it was in Galisteo, which is an incredible sort of place because it's just this huge bowl, a vast bowl. There's this huge expanse of land, and it's surrounded by mountain ranges in the distance. So you become really aware of the curvature, and the feeling is very much earth, sky, and human. And I would go up to the top of the building and just take these 360-degree panoramic views. I would take throwaway cameras that I would buy at the local store because it was pre-iPhone, and just click, 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 and then I would tape them together so that they all kind of went, came together the way they were supposed to. And I was, just, I kept seeing this repetition of these shapes and this kind of mirroring of sky and mountains. I got, in this, shot, you can sort of see the way the light etches the mountain range. The mountain range is this physical thing, and then the clouds going over it create another physical thing. So that was fascinating to me, and the way that the sky and the earth were in this constant dialogue cut with the horizon was really, compelling to me. And I began making these cutout drawings based on the photographs, and that's now. These are much later drawings from a notebook, but basically the cutout drawings led to the idea of making these curved shapes. And drawing, I did. That's all I did out there. I didn't do any painting. I just drew. And I will say that drawings are a huge part of my practice, and it's where I work out a lot of things, and where really the content for the paintings comes from. I do notebook drawings. I do all sorts of drawings, and the next ones are just two we put in to show, just some things from a notebook.
But do you always take photos? I mean, I know that you have actually a great relationship to place, and how often do you do such photos?
I don't really. This was a kind of a one-shot thing, these panoramas. I did it for a series of years out there because it was just this, it was fun, and there's just this amazing, stuff happening all the time, and it became a way to record it. I never really thought of working directly from photographs, but I think you can see even just in these two little drawings that so much of what was there kind of informs my thinking. If you go on to the next one, you'll see that this is how, the drawings begin to come into the first things that I do on the panels. And I very often, I start in different ways, depending. It's complicated because I feel everything in the painting has to interlock. So where do you start? Do you start with the color? Do you start with the line? I wanted to make something that felt like every part of it was active, and I wanted to give a sense of in a sense, kind of moving through something, moving through space, moving through light, and I wanted to build that sense of change or imminent movement or change somehow into the work, and that's what I've been trying to do. So this is the very, say, beginning stages of painting, and
but your drawings are the really early stages, right? I mean, you said
yeah, the
you
drawings
think of
are
them
really,
as doodlings and free,
that's
just
right.
free thinking.
That's right. They're kind
experimental.
of, yeah, that's right. They're a way of just thinking, thinking about possibilities. And then when I find a drawing that I really like, or that I think of as having potential to be something that I want to make larger, then I kind of sort of start to zero in. The next ones are so you just saw a linear approach to the painting. Sometimes I start with just shapes that are colors, and this particular, this is just showing me working on something which started out in black and white and went to color. I almost never work like this in this kind of way. One thing looking, like I'm transposing it from black and white to color, then to the, very often they're huge changes, and sometimes I just ignore the drawing altogether. But it's a way into thinking about where I want to go with a painting. So this is kind of another way of drawing, because it's, I've already decided on the configuration of the panels, and now I'm really thinking about how the shape and the color,
Is it always in
it's
that
going to
sequence?
sit in there.
But is it always in that sequence, like line and then color, or?
No. No, unfortunately, they happen, it's always different. Every piece is different, because also every painting really is a unique shape. Every once in a while, I get a configuration that I want to do a number of versions of, and so I think I've had, I think the most I've done of any configuration, single configurations, maybe I've done 4 paintings of a single configuration. But each one is sort of different, and each one kind of has its own problems and or challenges, and I feel like, they're kind of like puzzles, or there's a kind of a logic that I feel I have to sort of unlock in each painting. So the next ones are also notebook studies, same deal. And in these, I'm also getting ideas for the kind of light that I want to express in the paintings. I don't really think of, I don't think of myself as having a palette, so to speak, a set palette. I'm really more interested in getting the colors to work in some relationship so that you feel a sense of a kind of an ambient light of some sort.
Should we look at some more drawing?
Sure.
Okay.
And these are some more, watercolors where I'm just sort of trying, different things. They're all kind of very intuitive, and who knows if they'll lead to something. Maybe they will, maybe they won't.
And you say when you're painting that you don't make drawings, so at what point do you stop? Or isn't that, or that's not accurate, that you don't make drawings while you're painting? That you do one or the other?
Oh,
yeah.
Well, it varies, I don't, I'm not very methodical about how I approach these things. Sometimes I go through periods where I'm drawing and painting back and forth. Other times I'm just so into the painting that I can't think about anything else. But the drawings are always a kind of a well, that I go to. So I might even go, like, for instance, if you could go to the next ones. These were both, funky studies for the large triptych, which is in the Wiesbaden show. And these studies, I didn't do all that many studies, but the painting went through enormous changes. And it went from being actually one painting. Yeah, I guess you could go to that one. It turned out it was, first it started out as being one painting, the red painting. And then I went back to some, it reminded me of a kind of a glyphic ink drawing, series of ink drawings that I had done literally, I'm thinking 6 years before or something. And I rifled through and found these. And there were these 3 kind of glyphic drawings. Then I decided, okay, I think this one one painting needs to have some companions. so it led to this.
And that.
So this is, it went through, I initially thought about this as red, yellow, and blue, and then as I worked on, I can't even tell you, there are so many stages of this, and it had so many different manifestations. As I was working on it, they became like, I began thinking of them as being these kind of embodiments. That's how I thought about them, as they were kind of embodiments of light and form. To me, they had to do with different times of day, and they were kind of, anyway, that's all I really would say about them. And this is, yeah.
Well, you said that you were never a formalist.
No.
Just no. Would you want to elaborate a little? I mean, from the beginning. I mean, there are people you looked at in the 70s or 80s.
Yeah. I mean,
and you started out with,
the whole idea of shape, right? Was intriguing to me from the time I got out of school, and there were, was looking at the work of a lot of the artists that had showed at Park Place and then went on to show at Biker, Paul Nogenson, David Novros, Bryce, right? Early Stella, was, and, Kelly, all of those people were interesting to me. And, I at the time when I first got out of college, I was making things which were also not really on rectangles. They were on loose canvas, and they were sand and pigment, and I never really, I think, felt at home with a rectangle. I was always trying to find a way to expand it.
But as I asked before, why? I mean, what seriously, what, or not seriously, but,
Yeah,
why?
well, let's see, why? I was interested in a kind of, I was always interested in sort of in the physicality of the painting, in a combination, perhaps in a contradictory way. I was interested in the physicality of the thing, but also the ethereal nature of light working on it, working within it. So it was these different sort of elements. The break, the final break to this curvature was really a poetic one. It wasn't because I had a conceptual idea or a formal idea of what I wanted to do. It was what I had to do to express the kind of thing that I wanted to do in terms of the landscape, in terms of the feeling. And the forms came to represent to me, in a sense. They dealt with the curvature of the earth. They dealt with the horizon. There's a totemic quality to them, and I think that's, in a sense, they're about the figure there as well, But I didn't really come through it from some sort of, it was really just because I had to find a way to get out of the rectangle. And the rectangle didn't work. It made a picture of things.
Yeah, that's what,
It kind of, when I was attempting to work on these ideas that I had, they became pictures, and I was more interested in having them move and feel like you were moving through space, like they were really constantly shifting and changing. A lot of the stacking, the reason that I stacked them and the reason that they're balanced is because I think that reinforces the sense of movement. It makes it feel as though, in the next second, they could be slightly different, they could change. And that mutability was something that I found so overpowering about the Southwest, this feeling that everything was in constant change, was something that I wanted to try to build into the paintings, in some way.
Well, it's sort of like, as you said, the reality of a situation is that it's in movement. It's not fixed. So, why don't you talk a little bit about some of your influences? I mean, in terms of, well, totemic art, the art of the Southwest.
Yeah, I have. Well, I mean, I'm omnivorous. I mean, I really take from a lot of different things. I'm interested in painting from painting on apses, on walls, on bowls, on, you know, I think if you go to the next slide, you'll see that, I mean, I have my own drawings on the wall, but there's also this Mayan Vase, which was a vase that I think is in Houston Museum of Fine Arts that I saw and knocked me out, and it's sort of been with me ever since. This was about 15 years ago. So there's certain kinds of things which really are so Mayan, you know, I mean, American Indian, you know, Northwest Coast, the Anasazi stuff, but also, you know, Ravenna and Romanesque and Byzantine art and
well, altarpieces you mentioned at one point.
Altarpieces.
The multiple
right, the
panels.
multiple panels. I mean, you know, the work that I did before I went to these curvilinear forms were almost put together like predella panels. I mean, I have many things that I'm you know, think about. Chinese landscape painting I think about a lot, all these things I think come into the work.
Would you talk a little bit about how the internal shapes, I mean, how they play against the external shapes? How does that come about?
Yeah,
So.
I think of the inner shapes and the outer shapes, and you know, they're in a kind of a conversation. I mean, they're in a conversation. The outer shape is often not balanced in any conventional way. I mean, they're not symmetrical. I never work symmetrically, and so the drawing within them is always playing on the outer edges of the configuration. I want there to be a kind of a constant dialogue between those things. Sometimes sometimes the drawing is reinforcing it, sometimes it's contradicting it, but there's always a dramatic interplay between the two things. A lot of the drawing that I do creates almost like a kind of a kinesthetic memory, you know, for shape and a way of dealing with it that finds its way into the panels, you know, when they're assembled.
Well, you said that you really couldn't tell whether you were a colorist. I mean, like, you don't make that distinction between color and line, or if you are a colorist, or if you are a line artist or draftsman.
No, I think they're totally interconnected. I'm very much interested in creating a light and in the paintings. And I should also say that, you know, that the paintings, I don't know, maybe now I'm diverging from your question, but it occurred to me that, you know, the paintings in my mind, because of the way they're balanced and everything, they have a kind of a stance, you know. And I think of them, the way I approach them is as though the painting is determined by my what do you call it? The vision, peripheral vision,
yeah.
peripheral vision. So to me, so I think of the painting as being acted upon. This is kind of very abstract and maybe, impossible for anybody else to understand. But I think of the painting as being acted upon, in a sense. That it's part of something bigger. And that's the way I treat the color. So that when you get to the edge, the color is not just this flat thing that drops off. I think of the color as changing within each panel, as changing gradually. So it goes from, sometimes it'll go from dark to slightly lighter, or from cold to slightly warmer. And that's happening throughout the painting. I don't ever paint a flat, red or a flat, the colors are constantly modulated.
Well, there's so many layers. I mean, which you can't really, I think, see in these images. But those of you who have seen Joanna's paintings know how finely made they are and how layered. Around how many do you know? I mean,
it varies.
Yeah.
It varies. I mean, that's, I work with acrylic paint, and acrylic paint is, it's this dead thing. And you have to find a way to make it come alive.
So why do you use acrylic then?
Because I'm allergic to.
Okay.
I can't use the oil, and so the way I kind of have dealt with that is to I use a lot of different kinds of acrylic, and I mix sometimes pigment in, and sometimes, and I mix marble dust in it as well. And so, and I, going back, I think a lot about the quality of the surface, its mateness or its, shininess. I think that that the way I try to approach the color is to make it feel like weather, in a sense. I don't know how else to explain it, really. But I don't think necessarily of, oh gosh, it would look good if I did this, or look good. It's always about trying to get a relationship that creates a third thing,
So you were talking about balance, and would you perhaps talk a little bit about how you started? I think I saw somewhere that you said you started off making these multiple panels when they met at one point, or am I wrong? And then eventually you extended the line, so maybe in a way it was like point to line, but.
That's right. The first paintings that I made, the first shape paintings that I made, when I just got back from that summer of putting all those panoramas together, the first ones I made were based on roughly on two hemispheres that would come together. That one hemisphere would sit on top of the other, and they were very large, and they were built by a furniture maker friend of mine, so they weighed a ton. And they did not, at the time, they just went straight back to the wall. They were about 2.5 inches thick. And the way they were composed, basically they just sort of touched at that one point, and then the linear things would sort of unravel from that place where they touched. As time went on, I made more paintings. I began flattening those shapes, essentially, and they became more elongated. And that just allowed a different kind of drawing to go on between the panels. If you have this sort of extended space, it's different. So I got these sort of flattened shapes. So the hemispheres always had to do with, it's just simple, this, again, it's this bowl, this thing, it's like this feeling of being held between basically, in a kind of earth sky sort of situation. So as they got elongated, they began to change a little bit in nature. The drawing within them got a little bit more complicated, I guess you could say.
Would you say they were more landscape
Mm-hmm.
or
Were they more landscape? No. I just think they were just different, I don't think they were more landscape. I think they
are
were...
they boats? I mean, that was another.
Well, people say all the time, boats, canoes, ships, things like that. And I think probably that, comes from the fact that they are flattened, that they're flattened, that they have this curvature, that they move, that they balance, that they're also kind of, I'm very much interested in this kind of creating a contradiction between, buoyancy and gravity.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of, sometimes they float, sometimes they're and usually each piece will have contradictory directions in them, so that they'll have both buoyancy and both gravity, essentially.
So, and then you say that you also make standalone drawings. I mean, very large ones. But you also make drawings to scale, don't you, for your work? Is that right? Like large sort of. I'm thinking of another studio visit.
Yeah, no. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a drawing that actually corresponds a little bit to the Mayan vase that I had.
What?
Oh,
sorry, I don't know why that did that.
It just says Mayan.
Okay.
At any rate, so this is a large drawing. I mean, it's about 30 by 40. I don't know what the size is, but it's something like that. And I mean, this is just another way I draw, and essentially, it's like bigger. It's like a bigger version of the kinds of things that I do in my notebooks. It's just a way of kind of, it's very intuitive. It's a kind of like dreaming, really, and just there is a kind of I think that these are very important to me because they're, as I mentioned before, when I'm doing a lot of drawing, there is this kind of kinesthetic quality which moves easily then into the paintings. This is just, it's a kind of a, let's go to the next one.
Well, they seem more holistic, or not as in this different, the different panels,
Right. Well,
as some of the other drawings.
That's
yeah. absolutely
absolutely right. You're right. They're different because they are relating to the rectangle.
So
even if you're working on a page,
mm-hmm.
Even if you're making an isolated image, you're still kind of working in relation to that rectangle. It can't, it doesn't go away. So these really, I'm working, within a rectangle, and that's really how they're different.
So then, these are just a few of the, obviously, just a few of the issues or things one can discuss about Joanna's work. But then we're now going to go on to her show at Wiesbaden. And, I don't know why I was so taken with this, but I was. I was listening to another artist talk about his work, and he was talking about the exhibition as part of the process. And, well, of course, but it sounded like it can also be seen as seriously part of the process, that you start in the studio, which is private, and then you move to the next step, which is public and in a museum. So I kind of like that continuity of thinking that it is a process, and it's what all artists do. They begin the work in the studio, and then it goes out into the world, and that's when you more or less have to let go, except for the installation. So that all depends, on what kind of input you have in that. So we're going then to Wiesbaden. We're going to look at quickly the floor plan. The exhibition will be in the this 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 galleries, right? Going.
Yeah, it doesn't go. There are 2 octagons. There were 2 octagons, and I just had one of the octagons. And then wherever you see writing, those were galleries that my work was in. There are 3 sort of rectangles, largish ones, and those were about, I think the measurements were about 35 by 40, something like that. And if you go to the next one, you'll see this was a model that I had made just to sort of try to think about, how I was going to approach it, because the architecture was sort of very major part of this. The octagons were the beginning of the show. See, this is like actually reversed. You start in the octagon, and you move through the galleries, so that presented certain kinds of problems because we weren't able to kind of move through, say, from. I should say the show covered about 12 years of work, but we weren't able to go from early to late because it just didn't work out that way. We were trying to really put paintings in spaces where they would have they would feel right, and we also wanted to create rooms where the paintings had a kind of conversation, the same kind of conversation that they have in a studio where you're working on things and they're speaking to one another. So these are just a couple of the pictures of the large rooms, just to show you that there are these amazing ceilings with skylights. These 2 large rooms were very different in character because the prior one had these very elaborate cornices. If you go to the one, the earlier back, yeah.
Yeah.
So, that one, we ended up sort of switching what we were going to do in one room because of that. Those.
So maybe we just go through the museum.
Yeah.
This, this will be, whoops. Okay, here we go.
So this is supposedly going to just time, frame. So this will go like about 15 seconds of thing. And the way this is set up, this was the octagon, and the way that this is set up is the way the catalog was created to give a feeling of moving through the show and how each room, the beauty of this floor plan was that you see through to other rooms, and we wanted you to see through to paintings that made sense, and so that there was this conversation of the paintings within each room, and then they were kind of having a conversation in the next room as well. So that was one of the things that we wanted to do, or that we thought about doing in the show. The other thing was that we wanted to kind of create. I wanted to stay with certain bodies of work that I thought, obviously, not that they were necessarily made in the same couple of years, but that they were dealing with the same issues. They were dealing with similar issues. So, for instance, this room, felt like the room that had, in which the paintings kind of, there is not a linear, kind of form. They're like light eating into shape, and there was a kind of interplay between the, the forms and the wall for that reason. And so each room we wanted to sort of have a different character. And the thing that was so great about this wonderful curator was that he felt like I did, that we could just float these things within a lot of space. And we wanted, they're made essentially to expand, and they end up really actually, when you're in front of them, taking up much more space than they do physically. So we wanted to just create a situation where they could just expand into the space. They'd just be floating through these spaces. It became problematic to put, we had more drawings that we were going to put in, but then I guess they have a rule where they have to lower the lighting in the galleries whenever their work's on paper. So we decided not to put as many as we had previously thought to do, because we didn't want to, we wanted to keep the light up for most of the work.
But you thought it was kind of ideal lighting because it was both natural and artificial. So it was a blend in some rooms anyway, right?
Yeah, the smaller rooms did not have the skylights. It was mostly the larger rooms that had them, and that made it was the first time I ever really showed work in a circumstance where there was that much natural light. And it was quite a revelation, actually. So it would change, during the day. Even though they had auxiliary lighting, there would, sometimes the blues would come out more, sometimes depending upon what kind of day it was. And that was really interesting for me to see the work under those conditions.
Yes, you said the color changed for you. I mean, some you hadn't ever seen in that particular color.
There was one painting that I had that was just shocked me when I saw it, because the natural light brought out. It was one that had a sort of a very kind of a pink that I had made kind of very acid in my studio. When I saw it in there, it had brought out so much of the blue. It was amazing, So these rooms go, basically what it did was, even though we decided that we wouldn't feel it necessary to be strictly chronological, it ended up being, for the most part, chronological, and we ended up with these rooms, this room, and which were primarily works from not these works on paper, but the paintings were primarily from 2006, I think, 2005, 6,
and they were the earliest works, right? Yeah.
And they were the earliest works. This work is a little bit later.
So when you made the decisions, would you talk a little bit about how you and the curator did you have any disagreements, or did everything work out? I just think it's always kind of interesting in an installation. You know that all these wonderful artists, the minute it comes to an installation,
no, I know
something
it's
happens.
True. It's true. We really agreed on 99% of the stuff. we had the thing we disagreed with was the works on paper. And he wanted to put more in, and I wanted to take more out because I just didn't, first of all, I thought it was too busy. And I wanted to, and also, as I say, I didn't want to kind of have to lower the lights in any other room. So we just kept them in 2 rooms. And we had, they were very small drawings. Two of them were like 12, I think I had 4 or 5 12-inch square drawings. But for the most part, we really were in agreement about where we had worked out a lot of stuff on the model, and
there weren't surprises. You didn't have.
I thought there would be tons of surprises, but he knew the space so well that by the time he was working with me on the model in New York, he really knew what was going to work and what wasn't going to work, and which is wonderful because installing these is no picnic, and they were plaster walls, if you can believe it. So it was really, really challenging to install.
Well, I suppose the ultimate luxury, which is apparently what they did at MoMA when they were reinstalling, they had everything. They had maquettes, everything, life size for all those installations. So because they couldn't move some of the works very often because they were so delicate. So and you did this without maquettes to scale. Anyway, just again to see some of the details that you don't see in the other images, that you can see how worked they are, how painterly, how much tonality, the spaces between. So they're not, as you said, graphic. I mean, they are, they're very considered, and they're not, they're individual, and a lot of the measure, a lot of this, the spacing, a lot of the details are something you have to see in person, which is, again, I suppose, what painting has been about, that we get to see them, we need to see them in actuality. So, but these are some wonderful details. And maybe just talk, because you said edges are so important, maybe just lastly we'll talk about some of that. I guess we're going back to the beginning.
Yeah, this is just going to loop.
So, okay, well, let it loop, yeah.
The edges are really, really critical to me because they say so much about what the form is, the nature of the content, whether is how it absorbs light, is it near, is it far, is it whatever, so I do use tape to sort of initially, and then usually I sometimes I keep a hard edge, but a lot of times I kind of work with a brush or something or a rag or something to just sort of blend, for instance, this painting that's on the left, it's very painterly, the edges are very painterly. Unfortunately, you don't see that, a lot of times the work tends to look very graphic. It's, certain things, for instance, this red and white painting, that is it's a harder, it's a less atmospheric painting. So they vary depending upon what I'm trying to do within each work.
Well, there's so much more we could talk about, and lots of things I think that were overlooked that we should have talked about. But as in any studio visit, we hope it goes on, and we'll have other opportunities. So if there are any, so thank you, Joanna. And if there are,
Thank you.